Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
If you have ever sat at a family table with a bowl in your hands while your mother made a full tour of gratitude that landed on every single person except you, you know the exact kind of quiet that drops into your chest, a careful, almost professional quiet that says you do not need to raise your voice because the facts are already loud, and that was me, standing there with the mashed potatoes halfway between my brother and my dad while my mother thanked my brother for driving in from his big job, thanked his wife for being such a steady mom, thanked my aunt for the pie and my uncle for carving, thanked the neighbor for bringing extra rolls, thanked my dad for the roof and the mortgage and the stability, and then moved on like I was air. As if the oven that failed last week fixed itself, as if the grocery list wrote itself, as if the turkey brined itself, as if the guest list organized itself and the chairs sprung out of the garage by magic, and I felt something settle inside me. That was not sadness and not shock, just a very simple decision that I would no longer make it easy for them to ignore what they use. I did not make a scene, because that is what they always expect the overlooked person to do when the balance tips. They expect a dramatic speech or a tearful exit so they can call you sensitive and tell the story later with a little chuckle about how you always take things too personally. So I passed the potatoes. I said you are welcome to no one in particular. I cleared plates and loaded the dishwasher the way I always do when people start drifting to the living room, and when my aunt tried to catch my eye with that soft look she wears when she thinks I am about to crumble. I gave her a small smile that said I am fine, because I was, and also because I knew something had changed that they would not see until it touched them in a way they could not spin. After the guests left and the house was in that sloppy after-holiday state where everything smells like effort, I drove home without turning on the radio. Not because I was trying to feel anything deeply, but because I wanted to hear my own thoughts without anyone narrating them, and I made tea, sat on the floor with my back against the couch, and counted the ways this same pattern has played out since I was a teenager. Not with numbers, but with moments, like the time my dad forgot his medication and I drove it across town during a work call, or the time my mom lost her insurance card and I spent an hour on hold, or the time my brother needed help with a resume and I wrote it while my dinner got cold. And I kept thinking about how in this family the person who quietly does the heavy lifting gets told she is strong and independent and therefore does not need praise, while the people who drop in for the performance get the spotlight because they need it more, which is convenient for everyone except the person who is tired of being convenient. My phone buzzed after midnight with a message from my aunt that said your mom is in her room crying. Did you say something? And I stared at it for a long minute because there it was again, the reflex to make me the cause and also the solution. As if my silence had somehow wounded a woman who publicly erased me between two polite sentences, and I typed, slowly, I did not say anything, and then I put the phone down and let the next thought arrive, which was that my mother was not crying because of me. She was crying because someone might finally call her out on what she did, and for the first time in a long time I felt no rush to comfort or explain or smooth anything, because the habit of smoothing had kept me stuck in a role that paid in crumbs. I slept, not well but enough, and in the morning I opened the family group chat that usually holds birthday reminders and baby photos and little updates about appointments, and I wrote a message that was not mean and not long, just careful and clear. And I read it out loud to make sure it did not have heat in it, because heat gives people an excuse to ignore the point, and then I hit send, and what I sent was this. This year I covered the deposit for the turkey when the store asked for prepayment. I fixed the oven last week with the warranty service and waited for the tech. I coordinated the chairs and the table extensions and the pickup for the extra linens, and I am glad everyone had a good night. Consider this my thank you to myself since it seemed to slip your minds, and then I added one line for my mother. I am not angry. I am just done pretending my work is invisible. The dots appeared almost instantly, my brother first with a half-joking text about how I should send him my invoice, which would have been funny if it was not exactly the problem, then my sister-in-law with a heart, which I ignored, then silence. And finally my mother with a paragraph about how she did not realize I needed public acknowledgement and how she did not want to make anyone uncomfortable. And I could feel the hook in that sentence, the little twist that turns my basic human need into A personality flaw, and I did not bite. I said thanks for the clarification, and I left it there, because I was not doing the dance this time. You might be wondering why a message in a group chat counts as anything when the years are heavy and the habit is deep, and I get that, but here is the thing. People like my parents are very invested in the family story they tell to other people. The one where they are generous and organized and so loved that their children orbit them gratefully, and the only way to move people who think like that is not to beg for kindness, it is to make it inconvenient for them to keep the story straight. Without you, which is exactly what my message started, because now there was a written record in front of the whole group of what I do and what they skipped, and next time they want the credit, they will have to step over that sentence. And that is not as easy as skipping my name at a table. I put my phone face down and ate breakfast and went on with my day, and when my aunt called I let it go to voicemail because I already knew what she would say, and I did not want to be coaxed back into my old job of family glue. And then, hours later, my dad called. And I watched his name flash and stop and flash again, and I let it ring while I opened my calendar and looked at the dates of the next family event that my parents have been planning with their usual fanfare, a post-holiday dinner. That matters a lot to them because important people are invited, and I felt that same calm decision from the night before, only stronger now, because the first move was made and it landed exactly the way I wanted, and the next move would be quieter, sharper, and impossible to ignore. I did one more small thing before the day ended, not dramatic, just deliberate. I removed myself as the primary contact on a couple of recurring services that always call me first when something needs attention at my parents' house. And I put their number instead, and I sat there looking at the confirmation email, and I actually laughed. Not because this was revenge in the movie sense, but because it was the first step in a plan that would show them what I already knew, which is that I am not their backstage crew, and if they want a show, they can figure out their own lights and sound. And as I turned my phone back over and saw another missed call from my dad, I thought, good. You can start by figuring out why the slideshow you care so much about will not run without me. The morning after that group message, when the little rush of adrenaline had cooled and the old reflex to fix everyone's mood started to creep up my spine like a muscle memory I had trained since high school, I told myself out loud that I was not going to run interference anymore, because every time I rushed in to adjust a plan or soften a tone or rescue a deadline, I erased the evidence that my parents had created the mess in the first place. And then they would pat themselves on the back for weathering another family storm while I quietly wrung myself out in the laundry room like a towel that never dries. So I made a simple rule that sounded childish when I said it, but felt like oxygen once it stuck, which was that whatever belonged to them could live with them, and if they did not like how it felt, that was not my emergency. To keep myself from slipping, because habit is sneaky and I know exactly how I used to cave the second someone sounded helpless or important, I wrote down a short list that was not a manifesto and not a threat, just a set of lines I would not cross. Like I would not call pharmacies for refills, I would not sit on hold with insurance when a card got lost again, I would not translate every doctor's portal into plain English when my mom pretended she could not find the lab results that had been sitting in her inbox for 3 days. I would not log into their utility accounts to fix autopay, and I would not take responsibility for events that I did not plan, which meant if my dad wanted a slideshow to impress his work friends, he could learn where his files lived and what an HDMI cable looked like without me as his unpaid help desk. The first test came faster than I expected, because life respects no schedule, and my mother called to tell me her prescription did not go through, and she needed me to call the pharmacist. And I could hear that tone she uses when she wants to be rescued but also wants to sound above it, a tone that rides on the edge of a sigh and begs a daughter to be a good girl, and I said calmly that the pharmacy would be happy to help her if she called, that she should read the date on the bottle and the little label that explains how refills work, and I stayed silent while she performed the usual scene about how she is not good with these things, and when she asked me again, softer this time, I said I believe you can do this. And I hung up before I could swallow my own boundary, and then I put my phone in a drawer and took a walk because telling a parent no feels like holding a plank with your whole body shaking while the clock refuses to move. Within an hour, my aunt texted to say my mother had spent 20 minutes on hold and was upset that no one appreciates how hard she tries, and I stared at that sentence and laughed, not because any of it was funny, but because this is how the pattern protects itself. It recruits other people to deliver weather reports on your mother's mood so that you will come fix the climate, and I wrote back a message that was kind and boring on purpose, telling my aunt that the pharmacy always helps a few. Ask for the pharmacist and that my mother is capable, and then I set a reminder for myself that said do not respond to mood reports, because once you stop treating them like emergencies, they lose their power. A few days later, the second test arrived dressed like an invitation, which is another costume Trouble likes to wear. And my father called to ask if I could coordinate the family gift exchange like I do every year, because I am the only one who keeps track of sizes and shipping deadlines. And I took a breath and told him that I would be sitting this one out, and that if they wanted it to happen, someone else could set it up in the group chat with a simple checklist and a deadline, and he went quiet in that way that says he has already decided I am being difficult and ungrateful, and then he tried the old pivot where he talks about how busy everyone is these days, and I said I am busy too, and I am not a default setting. And I let the silence land where it needed to land, because silence is not a weapon when it is a boundary, it is just a sign that the old script no longer plays on this stage. Because I know how my parents operate when they feel pressure, which is to insist nothing is wrong while creating a dozen little fires, and then blaming the nearest person for not bringing a hose, I did something both generous and surgical, which was to export all the logins and notes I have kept for them in a simple document that lists where their accounts live and how to reset a password, and I put it in a shared folder with a friendly title so that when they tell people they are very independent, that sentence can be true, and I added a one-page guide that explains how to run a basic slideshow from a laptop to a television without anyone saving them. And I sent it to the family with a short note that said, here is everything you usually ask me for, you've got this, and then I stepped back and watched what happened when the scaffolding they never noticed started to shift. The first visible wobble was small but satisfying, like when you take a picture frame off a wall and see the clean rectangle where the sun never touched, because it showed me how much I had covered without calling it help. And it arrived as a calendar invite from my mother for the post-holiday dinner they were hosting for my father's work circle, except the invite had no address, no start time that made sense, and no details about who was bringing what. And the guest list included people I did not know and a few I knew far too well, like the colleague my father cannot stop admiring and the couple my mother wants to impress because their children feel like a measuring stick, and I let that invite sit without fixing it. Even when my brother texted me privately to ask if I could just jump in and clean it up because he did not want the evening to be awkward, and I told him very clearly that I was not available to manage an event I did not plan. Which was the truth and also the point. Here is where I admit something that will make a few people shake their heads, because yes, a part of me enjoyed the discomfort that followed, not because I like watching anyone fail, but because a controlled stumble is sometimes the only way a family learns new muscles. And when my mother called 2 days later with a frazzled voice to say the bakery was confused about the dessert order and the venue manager had my name on file from last year and could I please confirm the setup, I said the manager has your number now and the bakery needs your card on the order, and I waited while she tried to sell me the idea that if I just helped this once it would all be easier, and I told her I believed her, and I still would not do it, and then, because I am not cruel and I am not pretending this is easy, I gave her the owner's direct line and a 3-step checklist and hung up before I could be drafted again. The revenge, if you want to call it that, and I do because sometimes the only word that fits is the one polite people avoid, did not look like a big speech or a dramatic reveal. It looked like me refusing to erase their choices. It looked like me keeping receipts in shared daylight, and it looked like me placing the weight of their promises back in their hands, and if that sounds cold, remember the mashed potatoes and the thanks that drifted past my name like I was furniture, and tell me what. Warmth would fix that better than reality. By the end of the week there was a new energy in the group chat, a prickle of awareness that the person who used to oil the gears had stepped away from the machine. And my father sent a tight message asking if I still had the digital photo files from last year, because he could not find them and the slideshow for the dinner was not coming together, and I told him, with perfect calm, that the files lived in the cloud folder I had shared, and that the venue's television input required a simple adapter. And when he asked if I could just bring mine, I said I no longer lend tech without a checkout, and I sent him a link to the exact one to buy with curbside pickup, and in that moment I felt the balance shift another inch. Because we were no longer acting out the old story where I am the helper who never needs thanking, we were in a new story where my time costs something and my effort has a name. The last move of the week was the one that made me smile into my coffee like a person who has finally found the handle to her own door, because while they scrambled to fill in the details they never thought about, I reached out to the venue manager I actually know. The one who likes me because I handled a crisis last year without drama, and I confirmed quietly that my name was still on the preferred list for changes and approvals, and then I asked him to note in the file that all confirmations had to come from the host on record, which was my mother, and that no one else could approve last-minute tech help, and I thanked him for keeping it tidy, and I put my phone down knowing that the next time my parents tried to glide past me for a rescue, they would find a polite wall and a mirror, and the reflection would deliver a lesson I had been teaching all week without a single raised voice. By the time the week rolled around and the calendar block started to close in on that post-holiday dinner my parents had been hyping to anyone who would listen, I had settled into a rhythm that felt strange and strong at the same time. A rhythm where I still answered the phone when it made sense and I still showed up as a human being, but I no longer sprinted into every gap with my toolkit open and my sleeves rolled up, because I finally understood that all those rescues had turned me into something less than a person in their eyes, more like a spare battery they could plug into whenever their plans flickered, and while I used to tell myself that this made me reliable and therefore loved, now I could see it made me convenient and therefore invisible. Which is not a badge I want to wear anymore, no matter how shiny they pretend it looks. The first sign that my new stance was working came in the most predictable way possible, with a message from my father that did not ask so much as assume. A neat little sentence about how he had sent a draft of the slideshow to my email and could I polish it up and make sure it would run on the venue television, plus maybe add a few photos of his team from the archive I always somehow have. And I sat with that sentence long enough to feel my old reflex press against the door, and then I answered in a tone that was clear and even, telling him that the files he needed already lived in the shared folder under an obvious name, that the venue television took a standard input which he could handle with the adapter I had recommended, and that if he hit a wall, the manager would be happy to show him where the cable went, and I left it there without an offer to jump in, because offers are the hooks they tug with 2 fingers while telling themselves it was my idea all along. He did not love that answer, and I could feel the chill through the phone even without a reply, but within an hour a second message appeared, this time from a colleague of his who had somehow ended up with my address after last year's event. A polite note asking if the invitation time was correct because the calendar link and the email did not match, and he had copied the entire guest list trying to get clarity, and I stared at that long thread where my parents were hosts in theory but not actually present in the details, and I made a decision in the space of one breath that was equal parts practical and pointed, because while I am done being erased, I am not done being competent. And there is a difference between letting people live with their choices and letting them embarrass themselves in front of an audience they are desperate to impress. So I hit reply all with a message that was warm and specific and impossible to misread, explaining that the correct start time was early evening, that parking was on the south lot, that the venue would be prepared with a simple input for the slideshow, and that anyone bringing a dish could use the sign-up link I had just created so there would be no overlap, and I added one clean sentence at the end that said any final approvals would come from Linda as the host of record, which meant I did not steal the title and also made sure the credit and the pressure sat exactly where it belonged. And then I hit send and watched as the knot untangled itself in real time while compliment after compliment landed in the thread thanking me for making things easy and asking if I was the event coordinator again this year, and there it was. The little crack in the story my parents tell, because the people they wanted to impress now believed I was the one running the show even though I had not lifted more than a finger. My mother called within minutes with a voice that was sugar over glass, telling me she appreciated the help, but she wished I had checked with her before answering, and I said, steady as a metronome, that there was nothing to check because the information I provided was factual and already fixed in the venue file, that I had made it clear she was the host, and that my reply prevented confusion that would have reflected on her. And she huffed a little and tried to pivot into that space where I would offer to take the whole thing off her plate, and I let the pause hold until she had to carry her own sentence, and then I told her I would not be coordinating anything, that I had simply prevented a mess, and that if she needed anything else, she should contact the venue directly since her number was now on the account, and I ended the call before the old guilt could squeeze my throat. I will not pretend it did not give me a mean little thrill when I saw the follow-up messages from those guests start to include me automatically, because while I did not want the job, I did want the truth in the room. And the truth was that when people needed clarity, they reached for me, and my parents knew it. And the longer that thread lived in their inboxes, the harder it would be to sell the idea that I am just a helper who should be grateful for the privilege of lifting quietly, and if that feeling makes me sound petty to anyone who has never been skipped in their own kitchen, then so be it, because the petty women you ignore become the strategic women you fear once they stop apologizing for the way their brains work. In the middle of this, my brother texted with his usual grinning tone, asking if I was really going to let our parents flail through a slideshow without stepping in like I always do, and I told him, without heat, that our parents were fully capable adults who cared very much about how things looked and would therefore rise to the occasion if they had to carry their own weight, and he said I was being dramatic and should just fix it and stop making a point. And I answered that I was not making a point, I was making space, because sometimes the lesson cannot land until there is room for it, and he went quiet because he likes to win with jokes, and there was nothing funny in the silence I left for him. Here is where I slid one more careful piece into place, not sabotage and not generosity either, just a clean setup that would make the truth undeniable without me ever raising my voice. And I did it by reaching out to our cousins and my aunt with a short request for a single sentence each, something they appreciate that I have done for them in the past year, not a speech and not a confession. Just a line in their own words that I said I was collecting for a private project I was working on to keep track of family support so I do not lose sight of how I spend my time, and I asked them to send it to me directly, and the responses started arriving like little receipts with feelings attached. And as I filed them away, I could see the spine of a moment I had not yet decided how to use, only that when I used it, it would land gently and also leave a mark. Before the week closed, my father sent an uneasy message asking if I could at least test the slideshow at the venue since I was on a first-name basis with the manager. And I told him that I had already placed a simple checklist in his folder and that any test he needed could be done during setup with the help of the staff. And when he pressed again, I reminded him that he had the adapter and the files and the instructions, and that I believed in his ability to press play, and under the weight of that belief he backed off, which told me everything I needed to know about who had really been doing the believing in this family. If you are keeping score, and I admit a part of me was, the revenge at the end of this particular stretch was not loud. It was that reply-all thread that repositioned me in the eyes of the audience my parents value most. It was the way their thank you speeches would now have to navigate the reality that everyone already knew who steadied the ship without taking the wheel, and it was the quiet stack of one-sentence truths in my folder waiting for the moment when a mirror, held at the right height and the right angle, becomes impossible to look away from, and as I turned out my bedside lamp that night I thought about how power shifts in families not when someone shouts, but when someone stops handing over the tools that keep the old story standing. The closer we got to the dinner my parents had inflated into this grand marker of their social standing, the more I realized that the point was not to wreck their night or humiliate them in front of anyone, because that would only let them pivot back to their favorite story about the difficult daughter who ruins nice things. The point was to build a night that ran just well enough to survive while also letting the truth sit in plain sight where no one could pretend not to see it. And once I said that out loud to myself, the plan wrote itself in simple steps that did not require me to be dramatic, only precise. which is a language my family has never learned to speak with me because I usually translated everything into kindness before it reached them. I started with the little one-sentence messages I had collected from cousins and my aunt and a couple of people my parents would never think to ask because they believe support is a private chore that should be kept off stage. And I arranged them on a single page in clean type, just names and short lines like "Thank you for taking my kid when the sitter canceled. Thank you for fixing the portal when I panicked about the test results. Thank you for staying on the phone while I sat in a parking lot." And "Tried not to cry," and I printed that page twice, once to fold into a simple envelope with my name nowhere on the front, and once to have in my bag as a spare. Because if there is anything I have learned from this family, it is that redundancy is not a luxury, it is survival. Then I called the venue manager I know and asked a question that sounded harmless, which was whether the hosts usually give a brief welcome and thank you speech at these dinners. And when he said they almost always do because people like to hear themselves be gracious with an audience, I asked a second harmless question, which was whether there was usually a toast from a guest, and he said if someone volunteers, and I said great and left it there. Because I already knew who would volunteer if I put the right invitation in the right hands at the right time. That person turned out to be the wife of my father's favorite colleague, a woman who organizes community fundraisers with the cool capability of someone who does not need attention to feel valuable. And I sent her a short message thanking her for helping clean up the time confusion on the invitation thread and telling her I admired how she kept events steady without making noise. And then I asked if, on the night of the dinner, she might be willing to lead a quick moment of gratitude to the people who kept the year from falling apart for the family, not for show, but for the sake of the hosts who might not think to thank everyone. And she wrote back almost immediately with a yes, because of course she did. She is a woman who sees work and respects it. And I told her I would hand her a small envelope when we arrived, and she could use it or not, her call, and she said she understood. Meanwhile, I made sure that I was no longer the single point of failure for anything technical or logistical, which sounds like self-protection, but was also part of the setup, because when a system has multiple paths, the person at the center is no longer a hostage. So I moved all the old event files out of my personal cloud and into the shared family folder where they should have lived from the start. I labeled everything in plain language. And I removed my admin status so that if my father tried to get cute and lock me out, he would have to call support like everyone else. And then I took the extra adapter my father had refused to buy last year because he said borrowing mine was easier, and I walked it to the venue on my lunch break and donated it to their drawer, logged under the venue's inventory. Which meant that on the night of the dinner there would be no heroic rescue from me when a cable went missing, only a competent staff member who would pull out a labeled piece of equipment and help the host like any paying client. My mother, who can sense when control is slipping even if she cannot name the sensation, began calling me with the kind of updates that are not updates, reports about how the bakery was confused by her order because she changed it twice, and how the headcount had shifted again because she kept adding people she wanted to impress, and how my father was irritated that the slideshow looked flat, and I listened without offering solutions, and then said things like the bakery will do what you ask when you decide, and a headcount is a number, not a mood. And when she told me I was being unkind, I told her I was being literal, because literal is what stops the spinning. And she hung up on me twice, and then called back both times after she realized no one else would fix it, and each time I gave her one clear sentence, and ended the call before she could pull me into the undertow. To make sure the evening had a spine and not just a dozen floating parts, I drafted a simple run of show and put it in the shared folder where anyone could read it. Not fancy and not bossy, just a sequence with anchor points that would keep the room moving, a welcome, the meal, a short slideshow, a toast, and coffee, and I added a calm line near the top that said the host will open with acknowledgments, which was not a command, just a prediction my mother would feel obligated to fulfill because she thinks being the host means being seen doing host things, and I let that sit like a little magnet on the fridge of her mind, pulling her toward the moment she would stand up and offer thanks that would now live next to a second toast she did not control. as a small piece of insurance, and also because I was tired of being asked for things they pretend are missing. I sent a reply to the invitation thread 2 days before the dinner with a compact bundle of practical information: parking, timing, a reminder to arrive a little early if anyone had something to plug in, and I put a footnote that the venue had everything needed for media and that the staff could assist the host, and I signed my name without titles or apologies, and within an hour my inbox filled with those quick thank you replies people send when they are relieved to stop guessing, and I knew my parents saw them because my mother sent me a private message that said you always have to make it about you, and I answered that it was about clarity, and that if she wanted to put her name on the next update, I would be happy to step aside, and she did not reply because we both knew she would not. The revenge at the end of this episode was smaller than a grand reveal and larger than a petty jab. It was the envelope I slipped into the hand of my father's colleague's wife in the corridor outside the dining room while people were taking off coats and talking over each other. It was the way she nodded once and slid it into her clutch and said later. And it was the 3 quiet calls I made that afternoon to make sure the only emergencies that could arise had answers that did not include me. The adapter in the drawer, the staff prepped for a test run, the run of show printed at the podium, all of it designed so that when the night moved forward and my mother stood to perform her tidy version of gratitude, there would be a second voice in the room ready to widen the lens and place the mirror where it belonged, and as I drove home to change I felt that steady, low hum in my chest that I used to mistake for anxiety, but now recognized as control returning to its rightful owner, because the last move was set, and I did not need to push, I only needed to let them arrive at it. By the time I walked into that dining room, the tables dressed in exactly the kind of careful arrangement my mother insists signals class, while quietly panicking that someone will notice the mismatched chairs, I already knew there was nothing left for me to manage. No loose end that could be pulled into an emergency with my name attached, and that was the point, because this was the first family event in years where my hands were empty, my time was my own, and every moving part that mattered was either in someone else's care or already beyond the reach of a last-minute scramble, and I could feel my parents watching me in those sideways glances they use when they are trying to decide if I am here as an ally or a liability. I smiled, not too much, just enough to make them unsure, because uncertainty is where their control starts to crack. The meal began without incident, which I had expected, because the first half of any event is easy. Everyone is distracted by plates and polite conversation, and no one has yet noticed the cracks in the plan, but I watched the edges. The tiny moments where someone asked my father about the slideshow and he gestured toward his laptop with a confidence I knew was rehearsed, and I caught my mother glancing at her place cards as though she was confirming that the seating arrangement still matched the one she imagined in her head, and I sat there answering casual questions from their guests as if this was just another night for me, while in the back of my mind I kept track of the moment that was coming. The point where the evening would shift from their narrative to something neither of them could redirect. When the plates were cleared and my father stood for his part of the program, I leaned back and let the room's attention flow to him, because I knew that nothing I did in that moment could compete with his love of holding a microphone. And he launched into his thanks exactly as expected: appreciation for his colleagues, gratitude for the friendships in the room, a short nod to the venue staff, and a well-worn joke about how his wife made the whole thing possible, which, as always, left me as an unnamed shadow in the story, the invisible scaffolding that holds the facade upright while the audience applauds the paint. The slideshow played without a glitch, thanks to the venue's adapter, not me, and when the polite clapping faded, he started to set the microphone down. That was when the wife of his colleague, exactly as we had agreed in a conversation my parents knew nothing about, stood and said she wanted to add something before the evening moved on. There was no drama in her tone, no sting in her words, just the easy authority of someone used to guiding a room without making it feel guided, and she said that in any year, but especially in one like this. It was important to acknowledge not only the hosts, but also the people who make things possible behind the scenes, the ones who show up without needing a spotlight. Then she reached into her bag, took out the envelope I had given her, and said she had been handed a page with a few short notes collected from family and friends, each one naming something they were grateful for this year. She read them slowly, each line met with the kind of quiet nods and murmurs that happen when people recognize a truth they have lived but never said aloud, and while my name was not on the page, every person in that room knew exactly who those words described, because the examples were too specific to be mistaken for anyone else. I did not look at my parents while she spoke, because I did not need to. I could feel the way the air shifted around them. The tightening silence of people who realize the story they have been telling about themselves has been interrupted by facts they cannot discredit without looking small. She finished with a light comment about how gratitude is better when it is shared openly, handed the page to my father with a smile, and sat down as if she had just read a recipe from a cookbook. The applause was not thunderous, it wasn't that kind of moment, but it was real, the kind that means people are actually thinking about what they just heard instead of clapping on reflex, and I could see in the eyes of a few guests that they were filing this away, rewriting their understanding of how my family operates. The rest of the night went on as if nothing had happened, drinks, dessert, light conversation, but every now and then someone would catch my eye and offer a small, knowing nod, the kind that says they understand more than the surface. And it was in those glances that I knew the plan had landed exactly where I wanted it. My mother's smile was tighter than usual, her laugh pitched just a little higher, and my father avoided catching my gaze for the rest of the evening, which was fine with me, because I had no interest in forcing any confrontation. The work was already done, the page existed, the words had been spoken into a room that mattered to them, and no amount of selective storytelling after the fact could make those guests forget what they had heard. When it was over and people began putting on coats, I left without any long goodbyes, thanking the hosts politely, shaking hands with their friends, and walking out into the cool night air with the calm certainty that nothing about this victory required a postmortem. There was no speech to prepare, no gloating to indulge in, no follow-up battle to fight. The win was in the fact that my parents would now have to live with the knowledge that the people whose opinions they value most had seen, in a few simple sentences, the truth about who actually keeps their lives stitched together. And they had seen it without me ever once asking for recognition in my own voice. Later, at home, I poured myself a drink and thought about how the real shift wasn't that they had been called out, it was that I had stopped allowing myself to be edited out of my own life. I had built a night where I was present without being a prop, where the credit was given without me having to beg for it, and where the story could no longer be told exactly the way they wanted without someone in the audience remembering a different version. And that was the brilliance of it. There was nothing for them to accuse me of, no obvious move to attack, just a quiet, undeniable change in the record that would linger long after the decorations were packed away. They would still try, I knew. There would be subtle rewrites, little comments about how people just assumed, or how things got exaggerated. But the beauty of the night was that it didn't matter what they said in private later, because the mirror had been set on the table, in front of everyone, and they couldn't pretend it wasn't there. And while I don't expect an apology, and certainly not a thank you, I know that from now on, every time they think about hosting something, they will remember that night, and they will remember that their daughter, the one they thought they could thank by omission, had the last word without ever raising her voice.